man who couldn't die stood at the center of Russia's greatest scandal. While the Romanov Empire crumbled around them, the Empress of all Russia knelt before a Siberian peasant with wild eyes and filthy clothes, begging him to save her son. The letters she wrote to this man, discovered decades later in locked archives, would reveal a truth so disturbing that historians still debate whether to believe them. December 1916. Ice covered the streets of Petrograd as three of Russia's most powerful aristocrats prepared to commit murder. But their target wouldn't die easily. They would poison him with enough cyanide to kill 5 men. They would shoot him multiple times. They would beat him with clubs, and still, he would crawl across the frozen courtyard trying to escape into the night. The autopsy report, sealed for 70 years, would reveal something that defied medical explanation. Water in his lungs. Despite everything they'd done to him, Grigori Rasputin had still been alive when they threw him into the icy Neva River. Who was this man who held such power over the Russian throne that nobles felt compelled to kill him? How did an illiterate peasant from Siberia end up controlling the fate of 300 million people? The answer lies in a combination of mysticism, manipulation, and a scandal so deep it would help destroy a 300-year-old dynasty. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born in 1869 in the small Siberian village of Pokrovskoye, a place so remote that news from Moscow took months to arrive. Nothing about his early life suggested destiny had marked him for anything beyond poverty and obscurity. He worked as a farmer, married a local woman named Praskovia, and fathered 3 children. A typical peasant life in Imperial Russia, destined to be forgotten by history. But something happened when Rasputin reached his late 20s, something that would transform him completely. He abandoned his family and disappeared into the wilderness, claiming to have experienced a divine vision. For months, he wandered through forests and mountains, visiting remote monasteries, studying with hermit monks, learning ancient prayers and mystical practices that the official Orthodox Church considered heretical. When he returned to his village, he was a changed man. His eyes, witnesses said, seemed to pierce through people's souls. He claimed to have healing powers, to see the future, to communicate directly with God. Word of the strange holy man from Siberia began to spread. Peasants came to him with sick children and dying livestock, and sometimes, impossibly, they got better. Was it faith healing, hypnosis, luck? No one could explain it, but Rasputin's reputation grew. In 1903, he arrived in St. Petersburg, the glittering capital of Imperial Russia, where he would meet the people who would make him the most powerful peasant in history. The timing of his arrival proved almost supernaturally perfect. Because in 1904, after giving birth to 4 daughters, Empress Alexandra finally produced a son and heir to the throne. Alexei Nikolaevich, the future Tsar of all Russia, the boy who would unite the empire and secure the Romanov dynasty for generations to come. Except Alexei carried a secret in his blood, a genetic curse that would drive his mother into the arms of a Siberian mystic and change the course of history. Hemophilia. The slightest bruise could cause internal bleeding that wouldn't stop. A small cut could prove fatal. The boy lived in constant danger of bleeding to death, and the royal doctors, the finest medical minds in Russia, could do nothing to help him. The diagnosis was kept absolutely secret. If Russia's enemies discovered that the heir to the throne suffered from an incurable blood disease, they would see weakness, vulnerability. The empire's future seemed to hang by a thread as delicate as the boy's own blood vessels. Alexandra was desperate. She had already turned to various mystics and holy men, anyone who promised to help her son. Most were charlatans, but in 1905 she was introduced to Rasputin through intermediaries in the court who spoke of his miraculous healing powers. The Empress, German by birth and deeply religious, believed that God had sent this man to save her child. What happened during Rasputin's first visit to the bedside of bleeding Alexei remains disputed. Some accounts say he prayed over the boy, others claim he used hypnosis. Medical historians have theorized that his calming presence reduced the boy's stress, which helped slow the bleeding through natural means. But whatever he did, it worked. The hemorrhaging stopped, the boy recovered, and from that moment on, Alexandra believed that Rasputin alone could keep her son alive. The letters the Empress wrote to Rasputin reveal the depth of her dependence on him. Discovered after the revolution, these documents shocked historians with their intimate tone and desperate devotion. She addressed him as our friend and signed herself as his devoted servant. She described her fears for Alexei in painfully personal detail. She sought his advice not just on medical matters, but on affairs of state, military decisions, government appointments. The Empress of Russia, one of the most powerful women in the world, had essentially surrendered her will to a peasant mystic. But the truly shocking part came from the other letters that surfaced. Letters from aristocratic women, wives of generals and ministers, describing private meetings with Rasputin in graphic detail. Because while Rasputin had won the Empress's trust through his apparent ability to heal her son, he had built an entirely separate reputation in the salons and bedrooms of St. Petersburg's high society. Rasputin preached a strange and heretical theology. He claimed that one must sin deeply to be forgiven deeply, that salvation came through experiencing and transcending temptation, not avoiding it. For the bored and spiritually hungry noblewomen of St. Petersburg, this philosophy provided a convenient justification for behavior that would otherwise be scandalous. Rasputin's apartment became notorious as a place where married women from the highest levels of society came for spiritual counseling that allegedly included sexual encounters. Witnesses described scenes that would have belonged in the most debauched corners of Roman history rather than in devoutly Orthodox Russia. Women kneeling before Rasputin, kissing his hands, competing for his attention and favor. The police, who had begun surveilling him as early as 1910, filed reports describing drunken orgies, naked prayer sessions, and explicit encounters with multiple partners. One agent's report, discovered in Soviet archives decades later, described Rasputin as having an insatiable sexual appetite and an ability to seduce women across all classes of society, from prostitutes to princesses. How did he do it? Accounts from the period emphasize his eyes, piercing, intense, hypnotic. People who met him described feeling unable to look away, feeling as if he could see into their minds and souls. Modern psychological analysis suggests he may have possessed a natural talent for what we now call cold reading and manipulation. Combined with genuine charisma and an understanding of human psychology that was remarkable for an uneducated peasant. The scandal grew impossible to contain. By 1911, church officials, government ministers, and members of the royal family were begging Tsar Nicholas II to banish Rasputin from court. Newspapers, pushing the boundaries of censorship, published increasingly bold hints about the dark forces influencing the throne. Aristocratic society buzzed with rumors about Rasputin's sexual adventures, his drunken behavior in public, his crude manners and blasphemous teachings. But Alexandra wouldn't hear any criticism of him. Every time Rasputin was sent away from court, Alexei would suffer another bleeding crisis. Every time Rasputin returned, the boy would recover. To the Empress, this proved beyond doubt that God worked through Rasputin, and anyone who attacked him was therefore attacking God's will. The more people criticized Rasputin, the more fiercely she defended him, driving a wedge between herself and virtually everyone else in Russian society, including her own husband. The Tsar found himself caught between his wife's absolute faith in Rasputin and the growing revulsion of his ministers and generals. Nicholas was a weak man, dominated by his strong-willed German wife, and he took the path of least resistance. He allowed Rasputin to remain at court while making half-hearted attempts to limit his influence. This satisfied no one and made the Tsar appear either complicit in the scandal or too weak to control his own household. Then came August 1914 and the outbreak of World War I. Russia mobilized its massive armies and plunged into a conflict that would destroy the old world forever. Rasputin, according to multiple witnesses, begged the Tsar not to go to war, warning that it would end in catastrophe for Russia and the Romanov dynasty. Whether this was genuine prophecy, political insight, or lucky guessing doesn't matter. What matters is that he was right. As Russian armies suffered devastating defeats and casualties mounted into the millions, Nicholas made a fateful decision. In 1915, he took personal command of the armed forces and departed for military headquarters, leaving Alexandra to manage the government in Petrograd. And Alexandra, in turn, relied almost entirely on Rasputin's advice for every decision. Ministers were appointed and dismissed based on Rasputin's recommendations. Military strategies were influenced by his opinions. Government policies reflected his guidance. Russia, locked in the most terrible war in human history, was effectively being run by an illiterate peasant mystic with no political experience, no military knowledge, and no accountability to anyone but the Empress who worshipped him. The evidence of Rasputin's influence during this period is overwhelming. Historians have documented dozens of instances where government appointments went to men who had bribed or flattered Rasputin, regardless of their competence. Military plans were altered based on his mystical predictions. The entire apparatus of Russian government began to dysfunction as qualified officials were replaced by Rasputin's favorites, many of them as corrupt and incompetent as he was. One particularly damaging incident involved the appointment of Boris Sturmer as prime minister in 1916. Sturmer was widely seen as pro-German at a time when Russia was fighting Germany. His surname alone caused problems, as it sounded German. But he had cultivated Rasputin's favor, and Rasputin had convinced Alexandra, who convinced Nicholas. The appointment sparked outrage and fed growing suspicions that Rasputin and the Empress were actually German agents working to destroy Russia from within. These weren't entirely paranoid fantasies. Alexandra was German by birth, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. In the inflamed atmosphere of wartime Russia, her nationality made her suspect, and Rasputin's opposition to the war, combined with his mysterious influence over government policy, seemed to confirm the worst fears. Secret police reports from this period, declassified long after the Soviet era, show that a significant portion of the Russian elite genuinely believed that Rasputin and Alexandra were traitors engaged in a conspiracy with Germany. The sexual scandals continued and intensified throughout the war years. Rasputin, now at the height of his power and fame, seemed to lose whatever restraint he'd once possessed. He drank heavily in public restaurants, groped waitresses, boasted about his intimacy with the Empress in terms so crude that police agents following him were shocked. On one occasion, witnessed by dozens of people in an expensive Petrograd restaurant, Rasputin drunkenly exposed himself while proclaiming that the Empress kissed this part of him. Whether this was true or the boasting of a drunk is irrelevant. What mattered was that people believed it was possible. The scandal had metastasized beyond Rasputin's actual behavior into something far more damaging to the monarchy. Across Russia, in peasant villages and aristocratic salons alike, people whispered that the German Empress was Rasputin's lover, that he had bewitched her with his sexual prowess and hypnotic powers, that the heir to the throne might not even be the Tsar's son. Political cartoons distributed underground to evade censorship depicted Alexandra and Rasputin in increasingly explicit and insulting scenes. One showed the Empress as a puppet with Rasputin's hand controlling her strings. Another portrayed them naked together while the Russian eagle wept in the background. These weren't just attacks on Rasputin, they were attacks on the monarchy itself, on the sacred image of the Tsar and his family that had held the empire together for 3 centuries. By late 1916, even the Tsar's own family was begging him to act. His mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, wrote him desperate letters pleading with him to banish Rasputin before it was too late. Grand dukes and duchesses, his own cousins and uncles, warned him that revolution was brewing and that Rasputin had become the symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. The Duma, Russia's parliament, held debates where members openly blamed Rasputin for Russia's military defeats and political chaos. But Alexandra would not allow it. Every attempt to remove Rasputin was met with her fierce resistance, and Nicholas, weak as always, yielded to his wife. In the hundreds of letters they exchanged during this period, preserved in archives and later published, Alexandra's devotion to Rasputin borders on religious mania. She called him a saint, a prophet, Russia's savior. She interpreted every criticism of him as persecution by the forces of evil. She seemed completely blind to how her defense of him was destroying the monarchy she wanted to protect. And so powerful men began to plot murder. Because if the Tsar wouldn't remove Rasputin and the Empress wouldn't allow it, then the only solution was to kill him. Not secretly, not subtly, but in a way that would send a message that would free Russia from what they saw as an evil spell, that would save the monarchy by destroying the man who had corrupted it. Prince Felix Yusupov was one of the richest men in Russia, an aristocrat so wealthy that even the Tsar occasionally borrowed money from his family. He was also Rasputin's friend, or so Rasputin believed. For weeks, Yusupov had cultivated a relationship with the mystic, expressing interest in his teachings, visiting his apartment, gaining his trust. But in reality, Yusupov was assembling a group of conspirators united by a single goal: to kill Rasputin and save Russia from what they saw as his malign influence. The other conspirators included Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin, and Vladimir Purishkevich, a right-wing member of the Duma, who had given impassioned speeches denouncing Rasputin's influence. These weren't revolutionaries or radicals. They were pillars of the old order, men who believed they were acting to preserve the monarchy, not destroy it. How tragically wrong they were would become clear within weeks. December 29, 1916. Yusupov invited Rasputin to his palace late at night, promising to introduce him to his beautiful wife, Princess Irina. Rasputin, who had previously shown interest in Irina, accepted the invitation. He dressed in his finest clothes, unusual for a man who normally wore simple peasant garments. Did he suspect something? Some accounts suggest he had prophetic dreams of his death. Other sources claim he was simply eager to meet the princess. What happened in the basement of Yusupov Palace that night has been reconstructed from multiple sources. Yusupov's own confession, police reports, medical examinations, and witness testimonies. But even with all this evidence, the story remains almost too bizarre to believe. The conspirators had prepared poisoned cakes and wine, lacing them with massive doses of potassium cyanide, supposedly enough to kill several men instantly. Rasputin ate the cakes and drank the wine. The conspirators waited for him to collapse and die. He didn't. He kept eating and drinking, showing no signs of distress. Hours passed. Yusupov and his fellow conspirators grew increasingly panicked and confused in the rooms above, while Rasputin sat in the basement asking when the princess would arrive. Modern medical experts have proposed various explanations. Perhaps the poison was old and had lost its potency. Perhaps Rasputin's chronic digestive problems caused by years of alcohol abuse had created enough stomach acid to neutralize the cyanide. Perhaps the cakes and wine somehow protected him from the poison's effects. Or perhaps the conspirators in their nervousness had simply failed to properly poison the food and wine. Whatever the reason, the poison didn't work, and so Yusupov grabbed a revolver and shot Rasputin in the chest. The mystic collapsed, apparently dead. The conspirators breathed with relief. Their terrible task was done, or so they thought. As Yusupov bent over the body to check for signs of life, Rasputin's eyes suddenly opened. According to Yusupov's later testimony, the man he'd just shot grabbed him by the throat with supernatural strength and hissed, "You bad boy!" before throwing him aside. Rasputin then somehow stood up and staggered toward the stairs, trying to escape the palace. The other conspirators, hearing the commotion, rushed down to find Rasputin crawling across the courtyard toward the gate, roaring incoherently, bleeding but still moving. Purishkevich shot him twice more, once in the back and once in the head. Rasputin finally collapsed in the snow. The conspirators beat him with clubs to make absolutely certain he was dead, then wrapped his body in a curtain and drove to the Neva River, where they pushed him through a hole in the ice. But the autopsy, performed days later when the body was recovered, revealed something that stunned the medical examiners. Water in the lungs. Abrasions on the wrists and hands suggesting he'd tried to free himself from his bonds. Despite being poisoned, shot 3 times and beaten, Grigori Rasputin had still been alive when he went into the freezing water. He had died not from poison bullets or blunt force trauma, but from drowning and hypothermia. The man who couldn't die had finally died, but only after surviving things that should have killed him many times over. News of Rasputin's murder spread through Petrograd like wildfire. The conspirators were arrested but never seriously punished. The Tsar, under pressure from his family and fearful of making martyrs, exiled them rather than prosecuting them for murder. Much of Russian society celebrated Rasputin's death. Finally, people believed the evil influence had been removed from the throne. Now Russia could recover, the monarchy could stabilize, the war effort could improve. They were catastrophically wrong. Alexandra, devastated by Rasputin's death, became even more isolated and paranoid. Without his counsel, she became more rather than less erratic in her political decisions. The government continued to dysfunction. The military situation continued to deteriorate. And across Russia, a question began to spread. If powerful aristocrats could murder someone so close to the empress with impunity, how strong was the monarchy really? Less than 3 months after Rasputin's death, revolution swept through Russia. In March 1917, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 300 years, collapsed in a matter of days. By July 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, Alexei, and their 4 daughters were executed in a basement in Ekaterinburg, shot to death by Bolshevik revolutionaries who saw them as obstacles to the new world they wanted to build. Before his death, Rasputin had written a prophetic letter discovered after the revolution. In it, he warned that if he died at the hands of nobles, the Tsar and his family would not survive 2 years. If he died naturally, the dynasty could endure. The letter reads almost like a curse, a final demonstration of the mystical powers he claimed to possess. And whether through prophecy, political insight, or pure coincidence, his prediction came true with eerie accuracy. But who was Rasputin really? A holy man with genuine healing powers? A charlatan who deceived a desperate mother? A political manipulator who deliberately destabilized Russia? A drunken libertine who used religion to seduce women? The answer, frustratingly, appears to be all of the above. He was a mass of contradictions, impossible to reduce to a single explanation. The documentary evidence shows that he did seem to help Alexei during bleeding crises, though how remains debated. He did have sexual relationships with numerous women, though accounts of the scale and nature of these encounters are wildly inconsistent. He did influence government policy, though Whether he sought power or simply gave advice when asked is unclear. He did predict his own death and the fall of the Romanovs, though prophecy and political awareness can look very similar in hindsight. What's certain is that Rasputin became a focal point for all the fears, hatreds, and paranoia of a society in crisis. To conservatives, he represented the chaos and immorality of the modern age. To liberals, he symbolized the incompetence and corruption of autocracy. To revolutionaries, he proved the rottenness of the entire Tsarist system. In death, he served everyone's narrative, which perhaps explains why his legend has only grown larger over the past century. The sexual scandals, the political intrigues, the mysterious death, and the apocalyptic aftermath have combined to create a figure of almost mythological proportions. Books, films, songs, and countless conspiracy theories have kept Rasputin's memory alive long after the empire he helped destroy turned to dust. The mad monk, the dark mystic, the peasant who seduced an empress and destroyed an empire, these images have overshadowed the complicated historical reality of a man who was simultaneously more and less than the legend suggests. And yet certain questions remain unanswered, locked in archives that may never be fully opened or lost to history forever. What exactly was the nature of Rasputin's relationship with Alexandra? The intimate tone of her letters suggests deep emotional dependence, but do they prove anything more? Were they lovers, as so many believed then and some believe now? Or was their relationship purely spiritual, the desperate faith of a mother in the one man who seemed able to save her child? What about the rumors of German influence? Some historians believe Rasputin was simply a pacifist who opposed war on principle. Others suggest he may have been receiving money from German agents to encourage defeatism in Russia. Documents allegedly proving this connection surfaced after the revolution, but their authenticity has been disputed. Did Rasputin betray Russia to Germany, or was this accusation simply wartime propaganda that took on a life of its own? And perhaps most intriguing, what was the true source of his healing abilities? Modern medicine has proposed various explanations, from lucky timing to psychosomatic effects, to legitimate if poorly understood aspects of hypnosis and stress reduction. But none of these fully explain the consistent pattern of Alexei's improvement when Rasputin was present and deterioration when he was absent. Was there something genuinely unusual about Rasputin's abilities? Something that science hasn't yet adequately explained? The autopsy report on Rasputin's body contains other curious details that fuel continued speculation. His skull showed evidence of abnormal bone density. His liver displayed damage consistent with massive alcohol consumption over many years, yet he had somehow continued functioning despite what should have been fatal cirrhosis. Most strangely, certain organs were removed from the body before it was buried, and their current location is unknown. Rumors persist that these remains were preserved and studied by Soviet scientists. Interested in Rasputin's unusual vitality and apparent resistance to poison. Rasputin's grave itself has a strange history. After the revolution, when the Bolsheviks were systematically destroying symbols of the old regime, a group of soldiers dug up his body and burned it. But witnesses to this burning reported strange phenomena, claiming the corpse sat up in the flames as if alive, and that unearthly screams were heard. These accounts are almost certainly exaggerated or fabricated, the stuff of legend rather than history. But they demonstrate how thoroughly Rasputin had become a figure of supernatural dread even in death. His influence extended far beyond Russia. The image of Rasputin, the mad monk who controlled an empire through mystical powers and sexual magnetism, became a template for countless fictional villains. His story was adapted, reimagined, and embellished in works ranging from Hollywood films to pulp novels to serious historical studies. The 1932 film Rasputin and the Empress was so controversial in its depictions that it led to major changes in libel law. The 1978 disco song Rasputin by Boney M became an international hit, introducing his legend to new generations with the memorable lyric describing him as Russia's greatest love machine. In Russia itself, attitudes toward Rasputin have shifted dramatically over the past century. Soviet historians depicted him as a perfect symbol of czarist decadence and corruption, a charlatan who exploited the superstitions of a degenerate aristocracy. After the fall of the Soviet Union, some Russian Orthodox believers have attempted to rehabilitate him as a genuinely holy man who was martyred by forces of evil. A small but vocal minority even advocate for his canonization as a saint, though mainstream Orthodox authorities have rejected this idea. Recent DNA testing on remains claimed to be Rasputin's have produced intriguing results, suggesting genetic markers associated with certain neurological conditions that might explain his unusual eyes and potential hypnotic abilities. But the authenticity of these remains has been questioned, and the scientific conclusions remain controversial. Like everything about Rasputin, even modern forensic science cannot provide definitive answers that satisfy everyone. What cannot be disputed is the role Rasputin played in the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. Whether his influence was the cause, a symptom, or a catalyst of that collapse is still debated, but his presence at the heart of the scandal undeniably weakened the monarchy at the worst possible time. The sexual scandals destroyed respect for the throne. The political influence enraged the elite. The German conspiracy theories poisoned public opinion. And the murder revealed the monarchy's weakness to everyone. If Rasputin had never existed, would the Russian Revolution have still happened? Almost certainly. The structural problems of Tsarist Russia, the catastrophic costs of World War I, the centuries of inequality and oppression, these forces were creating revolutionary pressure that no single individual could have stopped or caused. But Rasputin accelerated the process, became a symbol that united different opposition groups and, most critically, isolated the royal family from the very people who might have saved them. Alexandra's letters to Rasputin, which survive in multiple archives, make painful reading in light of what came after. She trusted him completely, believed he could save not just her son but Russia itself, and could not or would not see how her faith in him was destroying everything she wanted to protect. The tragedy is not that she was foolish or evil, but that maternal love and religious devotion, in themselves admirable qualities, were manipulated and twisted into instruments of political catastrophe. And Rasputin himself? Was he evil? Did he deliberately set out to destroy the Russian monarchy? The evidence suggests not. He appears to have genuinely believed in his own powers and mission. He seems to have been sincerely devoted to Alexei and to have cared in his fashion for Alexandra. His political advice, while often disastrous, appears to have been offered in good faith based on his limited understanding of complex issues. He was a peasant thrust into a world of power politics he couldn't fully comprehend, armed with charisma and mysticism but lacking education, training, or moral restraints. His sexual behavior, while shocking and exploitative by modern standards, was not unusual for holy men and spiritual teachers throughout history who have claimed that conventional morality didn't apply to them. From medieval monks to modern cult leaders, the pattern is depressingly consistent. Power, spiritual authority, and lack of accountability create environments where sexual abuse flourishes. Rasputin was neither the first nor the last to use religious position to gain sexual access to vulnerable people. What makes Rasputin's story resonate across the decades is how thoroughly modern it feels. A charismatic outsider gains access to power through a combination of perceived expertise and emotional manipulation. He builds a devoted following despite evidence of wrongdoing. Elites are too divided and weak to stop him until it's too late. His presence becomes a symbol that different groups interpret according to their own biases and agendas. And finally, his removal fails to solve the underlying problems, revealing that he was a symptom rather than the disease. The documents that survived, hidden in archives and private collections, continue to surface and surprise us. As recently as 2016, a cache of previously unknown photographs of Rasputin were discovered in a French private collection, showing him in moments of apparent normalcy, playing with children, standing awkwardly in formal clothes, looking less like a mystic monster and more like a confused peasant in a world he never made. These images humanize him in ways that the legend resists. But other documents, darker ones, continue to hide in sealed archives or private hands. The complete records of the secret police surveillance of Rasputin, which would contain detailed accounts of his activities and conversations, have never been fully released. The medical files from Alexei's illnesses, which might shed light on what Rasputin actually did or didn't do, remain classified or lost. The private diaries of Alexandra, which could reveal the true nature of her feelings for Rasputin, were partially destroyed during the revolution, and what survived has been heavily censored in published versions. And so the mystery persists, fed by these gaps in the historical record, by the inherent ambiguity of the evidence that does exist, and by our endless fascination with the idea of a single individual who could change the course of history through sheer force of personality and mysterious powers. Rasputin has become a legend that transcends the historical facts, a symbol of the dangers of irrational faith, unchecked power, and moral corruption at the highest levels. In the end, perhaps that's the most important truth about Rasputin. Not whether he was a saint or charlatan, healer or fraud, prophet or manipulator, but that he was all these things simultaneously, a human being complex and contradictory enough to defy simple categorization. He lived in a time of apocalyptic change, became entangled with people whose decisions affected millions, and left behind a legacy of scandal, mystery, and tragedy that continues to fascinate us more than a century after his violent death in the frozen waters of the Neva River. The man who couldn't die finally died, but the questions he left behind remain immortal.